So let's get started on grant writing. We're going to start with kind of an overview of grantsmanship tips brought to you by Mario and myself. So we'll start with getting started. And the idea here is that grant writing actually starts long before you sit down and put your fingers to the keyboard. So just from the more experienced faculty grant writers, how long do you guys take to write a grant? I mean, just writing it. Just shout it out. 3 months. 6 months. Actually writing it. 2 months. Okay. Yeah, I generally take a month to actually write it. Okay. However, my planning process goes a year ahead of what the deadline is. Okay. So some of the things you want to consider is, what are your institutional priorities? So that might shape what kind of a grant you should be going after. So for example, in my institution really does not like to waive overhead costs. They really don't. They'll do it if you're a junior faculty, but once you've got tenure, they don't want to see those kind of grants come across their threshold from you. So these are kinds of things that you should know about your own institution that might affect what kind of a grant you're going after. You want to define the scope of the problem. We heard a lot about this as a challenge area for some people. And then one of the things that I do a year out is I sit down and I make a priority list for the year. And one of the things that shapes that is what grants are going out, because those are the papers that have to come out first in order to support that grant submission. And I do that a year in advance. You want to identify what expertise you need for the grant and get either your co-investigators or your collaborators on board well in advance so you know you have the expertise to move forward. Some of these might be internal. Some of them you may need to go to another institution to line up that kind of expertise if you don't have it locally. And then finally, determine what additional resources you need, either from your institution or from collaborators. So we heard this morning already about getting an external review, either from somebody outside your department or maybe outside your institution. And we've heard one example about somebody being paid within their own institution. When I was a department head, hired people from outside my institution to do a grant review of junior faculty when they've already gone in once, to help them negotiate through those reviews and up their probability of success the second time. So these are things that you want to be thinking of well in advance.
So let me interject something. The way we're going to do this, by the way, Elena is going to give this talk, and every so often I'm going to add something. So about people who read your grants, if you give someone your grant to read a month before the deadline, that's absurd, because you need to give that someone at least a couple of weeks to do a good job and really read the grant. And it's quite possible that they might say, you know, this specific aim is all wrong. You need to delete this experiment and you need to write a lot of new stuff, so you need time to react to that. So that means at least a couple of months in advance, if not more.
Another thing to consider is have a couple of levels of review built in. So I often send out my aims before the rest of the grant is written to a couple of people and have them look at it, because if those aren't going to fly, I need to know that right away. And then, you know, I can be working on other sections. And another thing that I do is I send a list of questions with the section I'm sending out. And if they can't give me back what I intend that section to reflect by answering those questions, I know I haven't targeted it right. Oh, so apparently I'm going backwards. All right, here we go. So I wanted to point out, and we say this all the time, is that people who get grants write lots of grants. And they also rewrite lots of grants. So we've already heard, don't take it personally if your grant doesn't get funded the first time. For those of you who are lucky enough to get a grant funded on the first time, my advice to you is sometimes you get that first grant not because of what you did, but in spite of it. And then that second grant hits you like a wall of bricks. Okay? So don't be afraid of that process. And don't make grant writing a special event. So right now I have 2 grants funded. I've got 2 in review. I'm writing 2, and I have 2 in the queue. Now, I'm not PI on all these grants. I'm PI on about half of them. But the point is, grant writing is not a special event for me. I write grants all the time. That's why I'm funded all the time. So again, planning, you want to find your funding source, and in the next couple of days, you're going to hear from a lot of different funding sources beyond NIH, and get information from the program officers. Program officers, their job is to talk to you. That's their job. So don't hesitate to talk with them before you are putting in a grant. Even if you're thinking about a grant, they've got great advice about how to focus things and what kind of things will head something to one institute versus another. There are a lot of online resources.
You need to know your program officer. Be respectful of their time because they're extremely busy. But those few minutes of each conversation that you'll spend with them are extremely important. You should be ready to talk to them. That means that you should have some idea about specific aims and be able to pitch your grant. And you should have pitches at several levels. There's the 2-phrase description, the 30-second description, the 2-minute description, and so on.
Okay. You want to check your schedule for commitments relative to the due date because you cannot have major things happening around the due date. That's just not going to work. And this is the best way to keep other people off your back, is to say, I have a grant deadline. And everyone will back out. So just make it public that you're writing a grant. And then finally, allow time for the university process. And this is going to be different at every institution. In my institution, they will not accept a grant more than 3 days out from the actual due date because it takes them that long. And trust me, the websites for the grant agencies get busier and busier and busier the closer you get to that final hour. You do not want your grant going up in the last couple of hours of the due date because the chances of a backlog happening are just too big.
And the main thing about a grant is the intellectual content, right? The research program and all that. But your grants office wants to see everything, all the administrative details. They want to see the budget, and you can have all the other stuff ready easily a month in advance. And they will review that stuff for content, even when the research plan is not necessarily final. So there's no excuse for not sending that draft that's near final for the research and has all the rest well in advance of your... And remember that the NIH deadlines are the same for everyone, for all the professors in your university, so that office will be completely overwhelmed when it gets to 3 days before the deadline.
Yeah. All right, so the first piece of advice is follow the instructions exactly. So I sit on an NIH review panel. I think Mario does at the moment. Several other people in the room I know do. And I can't tell you how many times we see grants where the directions aren't being followed. And trust me, we see a lot of grants in a year, so we know exactly what's allowed in every section. And if you're not following it, the first thing that occurs to us is like, well, if they can't even follow the instructions, how much detail are they going to attend to in their project? So this I shouldn't have to say, but apparently I do. Okay, the next thing is to understand the review process and help the reviewers advocate for your grant. So during the next 3 days, you're going to see the review process in action. You're going to hear more about the review process. You're going to hear about responding to reviews. You're going to hear from program officers about reviews. You're going to hear a lot about it. So I'm going to be a little bit brief here. And the first thing to realize is who is reviewing your grant, okay? A lot of people who are new grant writers think that it's going to be experts in their area. That's only partially true. That may happen. You may be the lucky one who gets the expert in your area reviewing your grant. I've been on the LCOM panel for several years now. I can tell you in my population where my most expertise is specific language impairment. In my first 2 years of reviews, there were plenty of grants on specific language impairment. I did not review a single one of them. Okay? I reviewed auditory habilitation. I reviewed autism. I reviewed cochlear implants. I reviewed all kinds of things that I really did have relevant expertise for, but they were not my primary area of interest. So you have to bear in mind that you are writing for a smart, educated scientist who is not necessarily the expert in your area. So if your grant did not do well in specific language impairment, it wasn't me. I just want to say it. If it was an auditory rehabilitation, I'm sorry. Okay, so you do need to make a grant understandable by people who are smart, who are good scientists, who know scientific principles, but may not have the specific expertise that you have. Then the other thing to bear in mind is the people who are reviewing your grants, they have a day job, and it's not reviewing your grant. Okay? So when does your grant get reviewed? So I don't review grants during the day. I work my job during the day. So then I go home. Okay? And then I deal with household stuff. And then sometime in the evening, I start reviewing grants. So if you're the lucky person that I start your grant at 9 o'clock at night, and I may get through half of it, and then I pick it up the next night at 9 o'clock, okay, I'm tired, okay? So you need to help me help you, okay? And the rest of the talk basically is about how you can help me help you. Because I want to help you, but if you make it hard for me at 9 o'clock, then I'm going to be cranky. And that's not the state you want me reviewing your grant in. Okay. Sing it, Nadine. Okay, so the other thing about reviewers is you can find out who they are most of the time. Unless you go to special emphasis panel, you can find out who they are. And so the NIH has webpage. When you download this talk, you can find these links, and you can actually find out who the standing panel members are for the panels that your grant will go to. So I've sort of dug down through these layers of pages, and then here's a bunch of panels that we'll review. And one of the things that you'll get told by the NIH people is when you write a cover letter, you might suggest which panel might be best suited for your grant. You can look and see who's on that panel, okay? And these will be the standing members that are reviewing. They might review 3 times a year. They might review 2 out of 3 times a year. So you don't know exactly who's on that panel, and you certainly don't know who's going to be assigned your grant. Even if the logical person for your grant is there, it doesn't mean they got your grant.
So one thing that you will see there is that there will be links for the study section roster, which is composed of permanent members of the study section, and then meeting rosters like this one, which lists the people who actually participated in a given session. That includes permanent members as well as ad hoc members who participated maybe via phone for just a few grants. So keep that in mind.
So it's not really feasible to write to a specific reviewer. But if you look at the panel and you know that there's a certain theoretical perspective out there, and your grant either doesn't have that theoretical perspective, you might be a little strategic about justifying why you're taking this approach and not that approach. And certainly, if you know you're publishing in an area where there's another person on the panel that's publishing a lot, you probably want to understand what kind of papers they've been publishing, because that tells you something about the general viewpoint. So you can use it as an orienting kind of an activity. But again, you can't write as if you know who's going to get your grant. You just won't know that.
Yeah, but getting the right study section can be extremely important. And sometimes, because of the subject matter, it's very clear that your grant should go to this particular study section. There's other situations where it's not. Let's say you're submitting a grant about the influence of speech perception and language development in cochlear implant users. So is that hearing or is it language? You could actually argue it either way. So you should consult with your colleagues to see which study section is most likely to understand your proposal better and to have a higher likelihood of success.
Yeah, and again, your program officers are often sitting in the room during these reviews, so they will know a lot about the study sections and what might be better for you to head your grant towards. Okay, so last, right to the review criteria. In the NIH, the review criteria are available on their website. You can look them up and tell what we're scoring. And they basically follow the headers of the grant. Other grant agencies, like you'll hear from the guy from NITR, they tell you to use the review criteria as a header, but they don't give it to you as the format. I've written, I'm probably the only child language researcher in the world who was funded for their doctoral program by the U.S. Air Force. And basically, I did that. I wrote to their review criteria, and they decided they needed to fund a child language researcher. So, write to the review criteria, use the review criteria as headers. The NIH will actually do that for you, and use the terminology in the instructions, because that's what they're looking for. When I'm tired and I'm going through here and looking for innovation and significance, there's wording in the review criteria that if I see it, it's like, oh, thank goodness, there it is. Okay, and then I can lift it out and smack it into my review. You've done the work for me. Now I'm really happy with you. Okay, so here's the review criteria for an NIH grant. So we give section scores for the significance, innovation, investigators' approach, and environment. These are all headers in the grant format. However, the score that gets you to the table is the overall impact. Okay? This is not an arithmetic average of the rest of these scores. It's not. It actually has to do with our perception of how big an impact overall this research is likely to have on the field. Okay? And the wording is it going to produce a sustained and powerful impact on the field? Sustained and powerful. That's what we're looking for. Okay? And then there are some administrative matters that we go through. And frankly, if these areas are weak, they will affect our overall impact score, but they don't get scored. Okay. So again, the overall impact score, the wording in the review criteria is the assessment of the likelihood for the project to exert a sustained and powerful influence on the research fields involved. Okay? So that's the target you're heading for. So I'm going to quote Mario because he said something brilliant last year, and that is, the NIH doesn't support good research. They support excellent research. Excellent. Okay. All right, so in terms of actually getting your fingers on the keyboard and getting a grant banged out, one of the things you need to do is establish some writing roles. So if you're writing the grant, you're writing the whole thing, that's great. You've got all the roles. But if you have collaborators involved or co-investigators or whatnot, you might want to divvy up the jobs to other people. But it's really important that your grant read as if it was written with one voice. So that means that if you've got pieces coming in from other people, you've got to also allocate some time to make sure that you get those things integrated such that you have a grant that reads with one voice. Okay? Use your consultant expertise up front. It is not good enough to slap the Biosketch in there and figure you'll work it all out on the back end. Because if you have a consultant, but his expertise is not represented in the grant, we're going to question whether you have a working relationship with that consultant. And it's not going to do you any good. In fact, you may be worse off than you were before.
I'm willing to bet that all the senior faculty here over the years have gone through the experience of getting a phone call or an email a week before a grant deadline from a colleague asking them, hey, would you be my consultant for this grant, blah, blah, blah. That's happened to me a few times. Those grants never get funded.
We've already heard to allow enough time for writing. Set some timelines for your writing, so give yourself deadlines. Part of the problems with academic life is that there are really very few deadlines, except for, the grade filing date. Other things just kind of roll on. So give yourself some deadlines and make them hard and then hit them. Okay? Give collaborators and others time to read and edit. Mario's already said that. Our morning speaker said it. Get an outside review. Again, you're going to hear this over and over again. I said, review by section. Don't give a person a whole grant. And frankly, these days, 12 pages for a body of a grant is not an onerous read. Okay? 6 pages I like even better. So, but you can give somebody your 1-page abstract or your 1-page aims, and that's not a hard thing, and then they owe you, or you owe them. And then finally, have everybody in your lab review every single grant that goes out the door. This is the only way people get exposed to the format. It's like any other narrative format. The more exposure you have, the more familiar it is, the better you are at writing them. Okay, one thing that's really critical is get models of funded grants from your colleagues. And it doesn't even matter if they're right in your area. You just have to be close enough so that you understand, like, oh, I see how the argument's building here. A great grant can be read by anybody. Anybody. However, the requirements for NIH changed in 2010. So make sure you have a relatively recent one. So there's still grants out there that are funded that are under the old format. We're getting close to where that's no longer going to be true, but just be cautious about that. Okay, format for readability. So first thing again, follow the directions. A lot of grant agencies actually have requirements for fonts and margins. Follow them. Use headers and spacing. So one of the things that I hate to see at 10 o'clock at night is a wall of words. With, even if you put a 0.6 space between every paragraph, I know visually I have a place to take a breath. Okay? And that's really important, believe it or not. Use headers and spacings so that I can follow along where I am. Avoid abbreviations and acronyms. And I know some of you in this room are guilty because I read those grants. So let's go over.
Can you go back to, I want to make a comment about headers and spacing. You should use all the 12 pages or 6 pages that you have and use them to increase the spacing and make the grant more appealing. And it's important not just because of when you get cranky reading these grants at 11 p.m., but also during the actual discussion. The discussion of the grant, maybe 15 minutes tops. So if somebody has to go to bat for your grant and say, no, he did say this, I have it right here, it's really good if they can go to the right point. And if you have that graded wall of words, it's impossible to find anything. So that's another reason why this is important.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go through acronyms, my own little pet peeve. Because I'm old, your grant should not be a working memory problem for me, okay? And especially if I started your grant at 10 p.m. and I don't even get to the rest of it till the next night, I can't remember what your acronyms are. So let's go through this. So good acronyms are acronyms that everybody knows what they are. So DBSBL, everybody know what that is? Good. Okay, ADHD, that's a fine acronym. NIH, another good one. Bad acronyms are specific to your field. Now, why do you suppose that is? Because I'm reading oral rehabilitation grants. That's why. And although I know a lot about treatment research, I don't know so much about hearing loss. So bad acronyms are specific to your field. So let's just take a poll here. How many people know what NWR is? Raise your hand.
Not widely relevant.
Okay, so that's a third of you. Yeah. How about IFG? That's a little bit better, a little over a third, not quite a half. All right, which means half the room's in the dark. Now, really bad acronyms are specific to your grant. How many people think they know what a YC is? 1, 2. Okay. How about a VWM -HL? I pulled this out of a grant. Yeah, exactly.
Very
There's
widely
the problem.
minimal hearing loss.
Probably. Okay. So researchers do not want to search your grant for your acronym definitions as you read, because the way the PDFs are set up, you lose your place. You can't get back to it easily. Now I'm really cranky, and you have not helped me.
You get crankier.
Crankier.
You do, yeah.
So we're back down to format for skimmability. And so I'll just reinforce what Mario already said. It's really important for your grant to be skimmable because we may have read it a month before we all get to the table. Okay? I don't have time to do things twice. So I'll review your grant once. Okay? And then I'm going to skim it before the discussion comes up so I reload it in my memory. But I'm not going to reread it in detail. So unless your grant is skimmable and I can find the major points, I cannot help you as much as if it is. So tables and figures are really good. Highlight the critical elements in your grant so I can find them easily. Okay, so here's an example of a type of header that somebody uses so that it really jumps off the page so that things can be found. Okay? This was a tip from somebody who put in appendices. So she puts the letter of the appendix down the margin so you know exactly which appendix you're on when you've opened it up. However, there's a caution about appendix. So raise your hand if you review grants. Look around the room. Keep your hand up if you routinely read the appendix. There you go. Okay, so most people are not opening those appended materials. So you cannot use the appendix to supplement the page limits of the grant, and most people are never going to access them. Never. So be careful about your use of appendices.
And I want to add, I am one of the few people who looks at them, but if they are more than supplementary, if they're part of the content of the grant, I will discount that because that's basically illegal in the system. So.
Yeah, the different parts of the grants have very different likelihoods of being read. I would say that the specific aims and the abstract are the parts that most people in study section read because you have to vote on everything, even if you were not a reviewer. So those are extremely important. Figures and tables have high likelihood of being checked out, at least. Appendices are the least. I mean, as a reviewer, sometimes I see that they make a reference to a paper and I may go read that paper, but that's kind of above and beyond because it's late and I'm cranky. So don't count on that.
Yeah, and, you know, it's not like I just have your grant to review. I've got a stack of grants. So the chance that I'm going to go above and beyond and read appendices and citations, no, slim and none.
Yeah, so saying the methods were described in my JASA paper, no, come on.
Yeah. Okay, so the project description or abstract, as Mario just said, it might be the only thing that people at the table read, because they weren't assigned your grant, so they're just sort of getting the overview before the discussion starts. And also, this gets posted to the public website. So you really want to do a good job of this. It makes the first impression. It should reflect the long-term goals. It should highlight the nature of the proposed research. And this is really critical. Make a strong statement of the importance of the work. Okay? Again, getting back to that review criteria. Is it going to make a sustained and powerful impact on the field? You want to start off with a bang and show in your abstract that that is going to be the case. Okay, so here's a dissected abstract. This came from an F31 that basically lays out the information like this. So they have a rationale up front. It has about 3 sentences. So cochlear implants are commonly recommended as an option for children and adults with severe to profound hearing loss. So now we know who the grant is going to focus on. These implants allow for significant improvement in speech recognition. Some more verbiage. During audiological evaluation, speech recognition and noise is often tested in adults and older children with cochlear implants, but it is rarely included in the evaluations for young children because of the lack of standardized testing methods. So now we have the problem. There's the gap that this grant is going to fill. And then the goal is stated, the purpose of this study is to develop and determine the effectiveness of, evil acronym, SR test, speech recognition test in noise for young children with cochlear implants. And this, I could lift that right out of that grant and stick it in my summary statement.
Yeah, this is good. Sometimes you read grants, and after reading many pages, you do not know what the purpose of the study is.
Yeah.
That's bad.
Yeah. And then this grant goes on to give you some information about the nature of the work that's going to happen. So speech stimuli will be common words and phrases equated for intelligibility, some more specifications of the nature of what's going to go on, and then it wraps it all up with a bow with an important statement. Findings may lead to the development of a new clinical speech recognition test in children that can be used to evaluate changes in cochlear implant mapping and benefit of devices to improve speech recognition and noise, such as FM systems. So, very little space, hits all the highlights. Tells me why the work is needed, what's going to happen, and why it's important. Okay, so I'm not going to read this one out, but this one is in just a different domain, dysarthria. So it tells you the goal right up front, tells you about the nature of the work, and again, ends with that important statement. And you can read this as you download the slides. Okay. Next section, Biosketch. Again, follow the directions. This is one of the sections where I see people deviate from the directions most often. So the Biosketch basically functions to convince the reviewer that your key personnel are actually capable of doing the work. So this came up as a challenge. This is one of the places where you can start convincing people that you can do the research, the other key personnel on your grant can do the research, you have a track record in the area of the grant, and the people are important for the work being proposed. All right? They're just not random hangers-oners or, something else, that they're actually critical for the nature of the work proposed. Okay, so the Biosketch contains a personal statement. So this is a new component as of 2010. So if you get older Biosketches, you won't see this. It's a paragraph. It's a paragraph. It's a paragraph. Not a page and a half. It's a paragraph that you use to describe how you are uniquely qualified to do the work, based on your experience with the method, with the population, with the procedures, things like that. You might also use it to talk about a collaboration that is important to the grant, that you've been working with this other person for the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. Keep it brief. Okay, here's what I don't want to hear in your personal statement. How you decided to be a doctoral student and how you ended up at your current institution and how you're driven by your love of humanity to do this kind of work. I don't want to know that. Okay, I want to know, why is it that you can do the work you're proposing? That's what I want to know.
And this is not just for you, but of course for all key personnel. So this means that what we used to do in the past, we have a collaborator, we ask them for the NIH Biosketch, doesn't work anymore because each Biosketch has to be tailored to the specific grant. So writing that paragraph is something that your collaborator may do or something that you may do, but it needs some thought in advance.
I often write the paragraph for other people's Biosketches because I know why I asked them to be in my grant.
Yeah.
And then I write it, and then I know it works. Yeah.
Ask a question about including Biosketches, because I've heard mixed things. So collaborators, I know you have to have the Biosketches. Do you then have letters of support from them too, or does the Biosketch act as the letter of support saying, well, yes, we've agreed to be on this grant?
I would say certainly if the grant is paying them, the Biosketch is fine. Okay? I think if the collaborator is bringing resources above and beyond themselves, then a letter of support documenting those resources might be good.
Yeah. A letter of support will never hurt, and it doesn't count against your page limit.
Yeah. The other thing, so I made notes in my last grant reviews panel about things that annoyed me, and then I put them in these slides. So don't recapitulate other sections of the grant here. Don't tell me about the methods. You can tell me about why you can do the methods. Like, I have had training in electrophysiology. That's good to hear. I don't want to hear, I'm going to be using the 1020 system to, map the N400. No, I'm going to read that in the other sections. Okay. And don't include information that's not relevant to the grant at hand. So a lot of times I feel like I got the grant Biosketch from a different grant. Okay, so here's what it looks like. There's a standard form for NIH. You can see the lead paragraph there. That's the personal statement. Then the instructions will tell you exactly what to put in what order to put it. Okay? So, here's the next page. So you get 15 publications that you can list. You can break them into the things that are most relevant for the grant at hand, and then things that are otherwise relevant for the grant at hand, but you only get 15. So if you can't count to 15, I'm not going to believe that you can do statistics. And that's good, because in the olden days, I got to put all my publications, which is over 100. And you got to put all your publications, which I'm guessing if you're a doc student might be 3. Okay? And now the playing field is a lot more level. Okay? Then you put other relevant research support. So, in big red letters, these are grants on which you were a PI or co-PI. These are not grants that supported you. These are not T32s. These are not grants that you were an RA for. These are grants that you went out and applied for and got. Okay? So it's a really naive mistake to put someone else's grant here.
So I've seen some biosketches where in the personal statement people included work that was going to be that was relevant to the grant. You know, this isn't in my publication list. I'm going to be submitting this within the month, or I do have this abstract that was done. Does that just irritate you because it goes outside the 15, or is it pointless?
You're not allowed to. The instructions say only peer-reviewed, published articles. Oh, in the personal statement, yeah, it doesn't belong there. What that is if it's directly relevant to the grant, it's preliminary studies. You put it in another section, and we'll get to that in a minute.
I would say that any mention of things like that makes you think of padding, even
Yeah.
if it's not.
And again, makes us cranky. Okay, when you are new, either a new investigator or new to an area, it's often a really good strategy to add a consultant. Okay? Because if you don't have a great big track record of publications, then the question comes up, well, how do we know you can pull this off? And if you have a more senior consultant, everybody will go, well, they've got so-and-so on board, so that really mitigates their lack of track record in the area. But make sure their Biosketch warrants the role. Early on in my career, I was around a lot of big names, and then I sometimes discovered that their biosketches were not as big as their name. Or they, had a bigger reputation for stuff they did 20 years ago. So you really want to, again, this comes down to give yourself enough time, because if you find that and the Biosketch comes in and it's not really all you dreamed of, you still have time to go out and find somebody else. Okay, back to Mario. Don't pad. Follow the instructions. Leave relevant submitted manuscripts for the preliminary studies section. However, F31s and F32s have different requirements for the Biosketch. You're allowed to put stuff on an F award that you are not allowed to put on an R or other grant mechanism. So check the instructions. Okay, new section, resources. So the resources section is designed to prove that you have most of the necessary resources to do the work proposed, that these things are already available to you. So you have the space, you have the major equipment, you have some or all of the minor equipment. Also think about soft resources. So, for example, core facilities. A lot of universities have core facilities. The ones that come up for people in this room would be like imaging facilities. Some places actually have subject recruitment cores, things like that. You can put those in. Statistical consulting. My university has free statistical consulting. You can be sure I put that in every single grant I write. Okay? So those are nice resources. Leave off resources that are not relevant. This is another section where I get the resources page, and it's like everything this person has available to them, regardless of the grant they wrote this time. And if I have to wade through your MRI resources and your EEG resources to find out if you have the resources to conduct a treatment study, again, you're going to make me cranky. So make sure that the resources are the ones relevant to the work you're proposing.
I would say this section is even more important if you're not at a top Research One university. In most cases, if you are at a good research university, reviewers won't even go through this. They glance at it, it's fine, okay, move on.
I see this problem more in institutions that have really good grant helping components, so they're providing the resources page for the they're taking care of a lot of this stuff. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to say you should really have control over it, no matter what kind of institution you have.
Yeah, that's exactly it. If you're getting prepackaged stuff from other people, definitely check it through.
Is there a tipping point at which you decide that you want to list your statistical consulting under resources as opposed to having a consultant that is a statistician?
I would say that it depends on how intrinsic the statistics are to what you're doing. So, for example, I have a grant funded that does test development. Well, the stats are really intrinsic to that. It's all about the stats, in which case you better have people on board who have the stats chops. For my other grant that's funded right now, the stats are fairly routine. So, I don't need... Basically, I can do them myself, but it's nice to be able to say, and if I get stuck, I can go to my statistical consultant who's free.
I would say it's important to have the grant vetted by a biostatistics consultant, even if he doesn't have a big role in the grant, because it's not infrequent to have a biostatistician in a study section, and they know when they read a grant that was not written by a statistician, because you use all the wrong keywords and so on.
Yeah, and I will say some institutions like IES always has statisticians on the panels. So if you know you're going into IES, you better have your grant reviewed by a statistician. If you are going into NIH, you're certainly going to have people who have some statistical sophistication, but they're not necessarily statisticians. But, And
you should involve the biostatistician very early on, because ideally they might influence your experimental design. What makes statisticians cranky is when you tell them, hey, I have this grant, can you do the stats? Because that's not the way they like to work.
Yeah, or worse, I have this data. Will you do the stats? That's way too late. Okay.
Just quickly, in a similar vein, is there a tipping point for too many consultants, particularly if they're unpaid consultants, or where do you draw the line on too many consultants?
Yeah, absolutely. If the number of consultants you have makes it look like you're going to spend a massive amount of time managing your consultations, that's too much. Or if the consultants aren't directly relevant to the work at hand, or if they're redundant, that would be bad.
That's what matters. You use the consultants that are needed, and you don't use any that are not.
Yeah, really quick on the consultants. I've noticed that people will sort of name drop on consultants, so they will add anybody who is sort of related to what they're doing. It makes me wonder, how well equipped are you to actually do the research if you really need that many people to guide you, which I look at as a negative.
And he reviews on LCOM, so pay attention to him. Okay, so this is basically what a resources page lays out like. You have the title that NIH gives you and a bunch of headers that deal with your different kinds of resources, and you describe what you have under it. Okay, and again, you don't need to be flowery here. Just tell us what you have. Okay, new section, specific aims. So along with the abstract, this is actually the other section that is most likely to be read by most reviewers, even if they do not read the rest of the grant. And so we're going to go through this in a little bit of detail. So the first thing is, aims are not necessarily hypotheses. These are actually two different things. So aims are what the grant is going to accomplish. That's the goal of the grant. Hypotheses are how we think things are going to come out. Okay? So that's the big distinction. I know when I wrote my first grant, I really had a lot of trouble with the difference between aims and hypothesis. But if you think about it this way, I think it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so people ask all the time, can one aim cover multiple studies? Yes. So if I have a 5-year grant, I often have 2 or 3 aims, and I have, a lot of studies. Okay? So obviously it's not a one-to-one mapping between your aim and your studies. So we can, this is from a specific aims I wrote, and it basically says this grant has 2 aims, and you can see that after each aim it says this will be tested in studies 1 through 4, and then aim 2 is tested in studies 1, 3, and 5. So the other thing to notice is that we got some studies that are actually testing both aims. That's okay too, okay? Because the aim is what your grant is going to accomplish. Okay. Reviewers will hold you to your aims. So if show how the background and the significance and the innovation relates to the aims, link each study to an aim, bold these points in the text so we can find them and we can see those links ourselves. So help us there. But I can tell you that if your aims do not match the other sections of your grant, there is no way you're getting funded. No way. Because the response that will come back is they have this set of aims and they have methods that will not answer that aim. So it doesn't matter that if there was a better way to state that aim that your study actually does map onto, we're still not going to credit you for that. Okay? Bill.
An aim like I'm going to understand cognitive processing of hearing loss is not a specific aim.
Yeah, Nadine was just saying to explore or to investigate. Too broad, too vague, not a specific aim. Okay, aim should be, This is an example of some of that linkage. So here's a study. There's a little preamble to that study, 2 sentences, and then it ends with, this is relevant to specific aim 2. So this grant is explicitly making the link between the study at hand and the overall aim, so that at 11 o'clock at night I can make that match myself. Okay. Finally, aim should be short and skimmable, because again, at the table, people are reading through that for their very first time, so make it short and skimmable. Okay, so the aim typically has several components. First, it has a lead-in that orients the reader to the problem to be addressed, the theory or model the work relates to, the general methods, and the importance. Then there's the actual aims, and usually some general hypotheses. Now, the reality is that your individual studies probably have a number of very specific hypotheses. We don't want to hear about those in the aims. Just tell us the general hypotheses. Okay, so here's a really nice example. It came from an F31. It's one of my favorites ever because this aim really accomplishes a lot in a very little bit of space. So in the very first sentence, this writer, this is Tiffany Hogan, establishes what the need is that this grant is going to address. So although the relationship between phonological awareness and early reading is well documented, language skills that facilitate the emergence of phonological awareness are not well understood. So that's the problem space. Then, next part, she gives us 2 competing theories. 2 theories represent opposing views of the emergence of this skill. The phonological deficit hypothesis focuses on the influence of phonological or sound processes. So see, she's helping people who are not quite in her area by saying this is about sounds. Okay, sound processing as a precursor to phonological awareness. In contrast, the lexical restructuring model posits a link between lexical, or word, processing and the emergence of phonological awareness. So now she's set up 2 competing possibilities that need to be resolved. Then she tells us about how she's going to attack this problem. This study will investigate both of these claims by examining phonological and lexical processing in children differing in phonological awareness. Then she tells us why her methods are innovative. So remember, innovation is one of those score points that we look for. Okay? A word learning paradigm will be used so that the phonological and lexical processes of the same stimuli can be compared. And then she gives us the actual aims. Okay? So, and here, what she does is she bolds the points here that relate back to the theory. So here's the phonological processing, the lexical processing, and then lexical representation. So coming back to these concepts that appeared above. So this is a really beautifully laid out aims.
There's nice spacing between aims, too.
Yes,
So
nice
remember that
spacing.
I had to review 12 grants. I'm cranky, remember? And I read the Hogan grants like a month ago. So what was it about?
Or I didn't read this one.
What was it about? I can go to the specific aims, and then I see that they're here, and I see the bolded words, phonological processing, lexical representations, and I remember.
Yeah. It's beautiful, a thing of beauty. Okay, so some common mistakes. First of all, the aims are a wall of words. Okay, my least favorite thing to say, because I'm starting my actual review here. So I've skimmed through your abstract, but I don't score the abstract. I'm starting my actual review here, and the first thing I am faced is this wall of words, and my thought is, you've got to be kidding me. Okay, the aims are too long. Third most common problem is your aims are too long. Really, they really are. The aims don't tie together theory and importance with the goals of the grant. The aims and hypotheses are confused, and the aims are not formatted for skimmability. Those are the most frequent problems I see. Okay. On to the next section. Okay. This is kind of the whirlwind introduction to grantsmanship. Okay, so research strategy is the biggest section of an NIH grant. Its components are the significance, the innovation, and the approach. So significance and innovation is where you sell us on the grant. Okay? So it couches the work in a broad theoretical framework or model, and this is an opportunity for a figure. So in my experience, there are visual people and there are not visual people. The not visual people don't like to use figures. Well, that's fine, unless you have a person who's a visual person reviewing you, in which case they're cranky because they cannot skim your grant and figure out what you're doing. Okay? So if you are not good at doing figures, get somebody to help you. Because if you are a visual person and you don't get any visuals, then that's not good. But if you're a word person and you get a visual, you don't care, you skip right over it. Okay. So here's an example about introducing theory. You don't have to make a huge deal about it. So in child language, there are two camps that if you really want to see an interesting screaming match, get these two camps in the room. And these are two camps that basically say that language is innate, you just need some input, it'll all get triggered, you'll all be good. Okay? Then there are the other camp that says, nope, you actually learn it. So these could be considered non-triggering accounts. And this one little paragraph just basically sets up, well, you've got these two camps, okay? And we've got to resolve between them. So in one paragraph, she's introduced two theories. Okay, here's a figure example. So this basically lays out all the major concepts of this grant and how they're expected to interact. And then the rest of the grant is going to refer back to this central figure. Okay. It is critical that you emphasize why the work is important because, again, the score that gets you to the table is whether you're going to make a sustained and powerful impact on your field. So you should identify where the critical gaps in your literature are, show why the work is interesting, show why the findings will be important, and give a sense that the work is needed now. So that was Ed Contour's major point, is that you have to come away with the sense that, of course, this work has to be done. The field can't move forward unless we have this now. That's the sense you want to convey.
The significance section is supposed to answer the question, why should we care? So going back to when we suggested that you should give your specific aims to colleagues and so on, if your colleague says, oh, this is very nice, that's good, that's not the reaction you're looking for. The reaction should be, oh, that's really cool. And you can tell that he's thinking, I didn't know you still had it. So you want people to get excited about something. Excitement is what significance is about.
Yeah, the last grant I reviewed from a colleague, my reaction was, this is so clever. This is so important. I can't wait for you to know the answer to this. That's the reaction you want to generate. Okay. Here's some examples of interest and important statements that were in a grant. So basically, the first line of this paragraph is what the project is going to do. So it's going to investigate basic aspects of adaptation to different frequency tables after cochlear implantation in postlingually hearing impaired listeners. And then the next sentence is why the work is needed. Okay? Because it will have important translational aspects. And as they will try to predict, based on anatomical, cognitive, and psychophysical measures, which listeners may have the most difficulty adapting to frequency mismatch. Okay? Then, if that wasn't enough, they give us another reason why it's needed. So why it's needed too, or the return of the need. Okay? So even more importantly, from a translational perspective, we will investigate a possible way to mitigate the effects of such frequency mismatch, and then a summary of the importance of the whole thing. Okay.
And that's specific enough. One of my pet peeves when reviewing grants is that a lot of them say, this grant will provide useful knowledge to improve next generations of hearing aids and cochlear implants. Sometimes it's obvious that that might be the case. In other times it's total BS because there's no possible relation between one and the other. So if you can make a case that's specific, that's good.
Okay, if you want to make my eyes roll, write the sentence, and this will guide future treatment directions.
Yeah.
And my reaction is, okay, I'm a clinician, prove it.
Yeah.
Because I'm not seeing it.
How and why?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so finally, the significance and innovation is not an exhaustive review of the literature. It is tightly written to the aims and studies rather than being exhaustive. So just set up what you're going to do and motivate it and tell us why it's important. Now, I've been saying significance/innovation because when I write these two sections, I actually write them as a whole. Okay? And so you might want to know, how do you divide things up? Okay. Maybe I'm getting to that later. Well, I'll tell you now. So basically what I don't like to see an innovation section say is, this work is innovative because this and this and this. Okay? And I see that a lot. And I think it's because people haven't really worked through this new format. Okay? So I want to see the innovation idea developed a little bit. So what I do is I think about, okay, what part of my background really motivates the need for this work? I put that in the significance. And then I think about what part of this work is new, novel, and pushes the boundaries of the research. I put all of that in innovation, and I flesh it out. Okay? So I have two really nice sections of approximately equal length. I don't say, I don't give a bullet point list of it's innovative because of this and because of this and because of this. And the risk you run is if I say, well, I don't believe it, now you're stuck. You got no innovation section. Okay. All right. So we already talked about that. Okay. So this section should be tightly written to the studies. So what you don't want to do is develop a laser-sharp focus on your problem. Put the problem to be solved up front. Do not do an exhaustive literature review. Provide key references when necessary. So there's where I was going to explain. Significance versus innovation. Consider figures that capture the essence of the issue being addressed because that will provide an organizing framework for the reader, and consider charts for summarizing where we are as a field. So I'll give you some examples. So most of my really great grantsmanship tips I steal from other grants. Here's one I stole. Okay, I was technically on this grant. But this writer, Luann Gherkin, summarizes 20 years of research in this amount of space. So she basically says, okay, this line of research, for the first 20 years of the research on infant learners, from birth to 12 months, here are the major principles that came out of that. Okay? And she just tells us what they are. And then she ends with, from this work, a new theory emerged, referred here to as the learning mechanisms theory. However, and here's where she's going to tell us where the gap is. However, the work to date has failed to, and then she goes on to say what the important next step is. Okay? So that's a lot of years of research summarized in a very small amount of space. Okay? Here's another example from one of my grants, a grant that's funded now. And basically, at the time I wrote this, I do imaging research of learning. And there weren't that many studies that looked at actual learning as people were in the scanner. But there were a few key studies. So I put them in a table, and I put the relevant specs for each study in the table. So in the text, I could just refer them back to the particular study I was talking about without having to give all the specifics in the massive amount of text. So this makes it very easy for the reader to refer back and answer more specific questions that they might have about a particular study. Okay. Another example is to summarize with principles that are going to inform the approach that you're going to go forward with. So in this, this is a treatment study of mine where we say several consistent patterns have emerged from the studies to date that will provide the basis for treatment paradigms. They include Principle 1, blah, blah, blah. Principle 2, blah, blah, blah. So I'm telling them exactly what we've learned that's going to guide the work going forward. Okay. Next subsection, the approach. Okay, this is where you're going to tell people your methods. This is not the place to gloss over details. Okay, you need to tell people enough that they know you can do the work well. If it is innovative, you need to show that it's innovative and justify why that innovation is going to be better than what has been done before. Justify your methodological decisions from the literature, even when you don't think you need to. So one of the things that drives me absolutely nuts is when people in my area throw down a bunch of subject identification criteria, and I actually know of literature that opposes that. Okay? That's going to kill you. Okay? So reference why you're picking out this test. And don't just tell me it has good psychometrics, because I know a lot about psychometrics, and I can tell you not all psychometrics are created equally. Okay, so right to counter possible objections or mistaken assumptions. So again, I'm in the non-triggering camp of the two camps that argue with each other vociferously. Okay? Well, I know the other camps out there. They may be reviewing me. So I'm going to write my methods to counter those objections that might come up. Okay? Or, as I like to think about it, they're mistaken assumptions.
I think it's a good idea to remind people about innovation, but if there's any content about innovation in your approach section, make damn sure it's also present in the innovation section.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it may not count.
Right. Okay. So, as I said, it's sometimes a nice idea for each study to have a little orientation to get your reader's head around the purpose of the study, and again, to link it to the aim it refers to. So you can download this and read it. Another good tip is to give the readers a template for your study, particularly if you've got a lot of complex manipulations. Go ahead and table it. So here's a study where we've got two groups. They get 2 phases of each study. So we have group 1 and group 2. You can see they both get an exposure phase and a test phase. But then it lays out what's different about these for the 2 groups. And then the text is continuing on the same page. But we've bolded here Table 6. So that if somebody's skimming through your grant and wants more information about this, they can find it in the text quickly. Okay. Here's another example of making the details accessible. This one's about the types of stimuli that were to be used, where everything's all laid out in a very skimmable fashion. And again, the table is bolded in the text, so you can find it in the if you are skimming. Okay, some space savers, because we're all looking for ways to save space. So summarize common elements separate from specific studies. So if you've got 5 studies that all deal with SLI, tell me once about your SLI subjects. Or if you have the same selection criteria for 7 out of 10 of your studies, tell me, studies 1 through 7 are going to use these subjects. Studies 8 through 10 are going to use these kind of subjects. Again, same thing with the data acquisition. If you're doing sort of similar data acquisition across studies, just tell me once, and other kinds of things like that. Usually also you should have one statistical section, not a separate one for each study, if you can get away with it. Okay, so here's an example about summarizing all the similar subject selection. So it basically gives a lead-in that orients people to the fact that they're going to be infant studies, they're going to be adult studies, and then there's subsections for each of those types of populations. Timelines can be really helpful, particularly for junior investigators, because it answers the question, are they naive about how much work is actually going to go into this? And if you give us a timeline, and it doesn't have to be too detailed, just kind of tell us what the major events are, that really does go a long way to satisfy that. So here's a grant that had 2 different kinds of studies, biochemical studies and MRI studies, and what was going to happen in each year. So I didn't break it down by month. It's just year 1 we do this, year 2 we do that, for this kind of study, for that kind of study. Okay, here's another example of a timeline that's laid out in a different way. Months 1 through 6, 6 through 12, 13 through 18, 18 through 24. Okay. Ogden and Goldberg has a great book about grant writing. Ogden used to be a program officer at NIH. It's a little outdated right now, so you have to get another resource for they still have background in significance, which is the old way of laying things out. Now it's significance, innovation, and approach. So you do have to kind of do this mental translation, but there are other resources as well. But the advice kind of translates the format. So I still recommend it to people. So first recommendation, do not assume reviewers are familiar with your methods, okay? Because, as I said, I'm reviewing all kinds of things. So I review MEG grants. I, yes, do actually have experience with MEG back in the days where they had single doer systems in the 1980s, okay? So you're going to have to hold my hand a little bit, okay? You need to use tabular data to summarize the design, use flowcharts to summarize procedures, anticipate problems, and present potential alternatives. If you anticipate a problem and present an alternative, and some people use a section for this, potential problems and possible alternatives. I love to see those sections because it makes you look sophisticated about your grant. If I think up a potential problem that you didn't think up and give me an alternative for, now it's a weakness. Okay. So here's an example of that section. This says potential problem number 1 is the adaptive speech recognition and noise test may be difficult for younger children in terms of the task and attention. But there's a solution. Children will be given frequent breaks and snacks between conditions to help with attention and focus. If necessary, children may need to be scheduled in 2 or more testing sections. So I'm thinking, oh, this person's actually worked with children. Okay. Then there's a second potential problem. If children are only able to complete one or some of the conditions in the study, their data will be included in the analysis. And then the solution, if children cannot participate in any conditions because of inattention and frustration, they will be dismissed from participating in the study with no consequence. So at least I've thought about the fact that this might happen with 3-year-olds. And again, I was like, okay, this person actually has worked with kids because they're like that. Okay. For statistics, you want to provide a power analysis for each study. That's required. Don't skip it. Okay? Link the analyses to the hypotheses, so make sure there's a clear mapping between what you're hypothesizing and how you're going to analyze it. And then, again, this is a place where we really want to see alternatives. So, for example, what are you going to do if your data doesn't meet parametric statistical assumptions? What are you going to do if you have a treatment study and you're measuring outcome in terms of % correct at the end of treatment and everybody ceilings out? What are you going to do then? Do you have an alternate way of determining which was the best treatment? So think about these things. Okay. Preliminary study. So again, the old grants did this differently. The new grants, you have a lot more flexibility. It can be in its own section. It can be integrated with other sections. If it's in its own section, you can put it anywhere you want in your grant. So you basically you can do whatever you want that makes the best case for your grant. And the preliminary studies answers the following question. How do the reviewers know that you can do the proposed work, and how the reviewers know that the proposed methods are likely to be successful? That's what your preliminary studies are addressing. Okay. So some of your grants that you're writing like the Fs and the RO3 and the RO21s, say that preliminary studies are not required. And then you got the reviews back, and it says, well, there's no pilot data or feasibility data. And you're thinking, but there was none required. Well, let me tell you. There is a difference between preliminary studies and pilot and feasibility data. And I will tell you about that. So preliminary studies are directly relevant to the proposed studies. They're usually things that are published already or in press or done. They're done. Okay? And they were full-up studies. So somebody said, I really only have pilot data. It was like, well, wait a minute. This came out in JSLHR, whatever it is. Okay. And she says, yeah, but it was only 4 subjects. If it's published, it's not pilot data. It's a preliminary study. Pilot data are typically data you collected for the grant at hand. And they should be clean, robust, and convincing, and your hypothesis should be in the direction your pilot data is going in. Okay? Because I've seen the other happen. So, okay. Yes. Tables, graphs, and images are appreciated, and again, it can come anywhere in the grant. So
it's rare to have too much pilot data, but I've seen it happen where somebody says, well, and this is the first 15 subjects of an experiment that was going to take 20 subjects total, so he actually did the first experiment already, but that's extremely rare.
Yeah, it used to happen a lot more often. I think people got beat down enough about it because if we think like, well, you managed to do 15 subjects without my resources, why do you need these resources to do the last 5? Okay, so here's a nice lead-in that actually distinguishes between preliminary studies and pilot data. So this was in a grant that this is the McGurk effect, if you're familiar with that. So the first sentence says, studies designed to examine the McGurk effect in language disorders are based on studies by Drs. Bullock and Norix, who were both co-investigators on this grant. Citation, citation, citation. So if they're published, they're preliminary studies. Then here comes the pilot data. So all these preliminary studies were in adults. Okay? So it establishes that the co-investigators have expertise in the McGurk effect. So the pilot data is, we have adjusted the response requirements to be more appropriate for younger children by training, by training all possible responses prior to the experimental trials. Okay? And we've also tested the associations in auditory-only condition to make sure the associations were learned. Table 1 presents performance by normal and SLI children's 4 and 5-year-olds during pilot work. And there is a table with some data. Okay? That's pilot data. Okay? All right. This is a technique I think is really nice. And basically, it's a summary of the preliminary studies that identifies the problem that needs to be addressed going forward and what's needed to address that problem. So you can skim through that. And moving on. All right. So some recommendations are begin planning your preliminary studies way before your next grant. Because if you need to come up with some pilot data, you've got to have some time to think about that. So again, this is why you want to be thinking about that next grant, whatever's in the queue. So my queue is still 2 grants away, but I already know what those grants are going to be, and the work to set those grants up is happening now. Okay? Write your preliminary studies after you write the approach, because that tells you what your preliminary study should say. Because initially, a lot of times as you're writing the grant, it's evolving with you, And so if you've already written the approach and gotten that all nailed out, it'll be very clear what's completely relevant and what's a little tangential. Okay? Provide examples that show technical expertise. So again, you're establishing that you can do the work. So here are a couple of examples from one of my current grants that basically says, hey, we propose to do some structural equation modeling. Hey, here's a structural equation model that I've published. So, I obviously know how to do this because I've published it. And we propose to do some tractography. Here's some tracks that we've mapped. So we can do this too. Okay. Recommendations, make the points visually obvious with charts and graphs. So here's a really nice layout, again, that I stole from I think this, again, Luann Gherkin, where she lays out findings from her previous work, so 1A, B, C, D, E, F, and then what those studies found and what questions they generated that the next grant is going to answer. So this is a really nice way to lay out a lot of verbiage in a small amount of space. Okay, and I'll tell you, the reviews that came back said that the proposed studies were well motivated. So, I think that helped with that. So another recommendation, establish the history of prior collaborations for interdisciplinary efforts. So certainly you should do it in your Biosketch, but preliminary studies is another place to do it. So this grant said, this proposal rests on the combined expertise of 2 investigators, each of whom have established records of research in their respective field, blah, blah, blah. However, we'd never published before together. So in order to establish a collaboration between the investigators and to explore the feasibility of the proposed work, hint, hint, we've been working on this, we have collected pilot data. So we're basically saying, we've worked together, we haven't published together, but we've been working on this pilot data that we're going to show you. Okay. So finally, we've given you some resources for additional sources to go to get some help. So the first resource is your program liaison. There are some web links for NIH stuff. You'll get a lot more of this from the NIH people. There's a web link for the review process. The NIH page actually has a video clip of a review session. So if you wanted to look at that, you can pull that up. Then a couple of books on grant writing. Yeah, a couple of books on grant writing. So as I said, the Goldberg book is a little bit old now. There's a couple of newer ones in here that are less extensive but fine. Okay. All right. So I really like this quote, which David Pisoni contributed. The only reason to write a grant is to get the money to do the research. Sending in less than your very best effort is a waste of your time and everyone else's. Okay? So I know I've said a couple of times that I have this whole, I write grants regularly. It's not a special event. I've got a whole queue of them that are in various stages, but I never let a grant go out the door that's not ready because it is a waste of everybody's time.
Who knows Dave Pisoni personally around here? Okay, good. So you'll recognize it when I say, Mario, it's about getting the money.
Go back to Elena's very first point about cranky midnight reviews. My advice I always give is never, ever give a reviewer a reason to say no. They want to say yes, but they know what the competition's like, and if all of a sudden something pops up and they can say no, that becomes very hard to ignore. So everything you do, you should make sure you do according to format, that it's clear, it's readable, it's skimmable. Don't have them say no.